J.R.R Tolkien, best known as the author of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, was not only a writer, historian, and linguist, but also a soldier who served in the First World War.
His experiences on the battlefield during the conflict would profoundly shape his works. With the horrors of war, the bonds of friendship, and the resilience of the human spirit all finding their way into his writings, giving a depth and authenticity to his legendary tales. This is the story of Tolkien's wartime service. In August of 1914, as Britain entered the First World War, a wave of patriotic fervour swept through the country, with many young men rushing to enlist. Tolkien, however, was in his final year at Oxford and chose to complete his studies first, joining a program that allowed him to finish his degree before enlisting in the army. A decision that drew criticism among family and peers, who saw this delay as unpatriotic. When reflecting on the social pressure of the time, Tolkien wrote a letter to his son in 1941, stating the following. In those days, chaps joined up or were scorned publicly. It was a nasty cleft to be in for a young man with too much imagination and little physical courage. After completing his final exams, Tolkien was commissioned as a temporary second lieutenant in the Lancashire Fusiliers on July 15, 1915, and spent nearly a year training at Cannock Chase Rugeley Camp in Staffordshire, where he would specialise in signals and communication, a role that required a strong technical knowledge. On March 22, 1916, Tolkien would marry his fiancée Edith Bratt. Following their wedding, she would live near the camp, awaiting his inevitable departure to France. On the 5th of June 1916, Tolkien disembarked from Folkestone and travelled to Calais. Upon arrival, he was assigned to the 11th Battalion of the Lancashire Fusiliers, 74th Brigade of the 25th Division, and began preparing for his deployment to the Western Front. Less than 1 month later, Tolkien's battalion was thrust into the Battle of the Somme, in what would be one of the bloodiest campaigns in history. For an initial period, they would remain in reserve in the village of Bouzencourt, though from early July onward, they would enter the fighting, rotating through the frontline trenches in the northern sector of the Somme, during which time he would take part in fierce assaults on heavily defended German positions, such as the Schwaben Redoubt and the Leipzig Salient. It was during these fierce engagements that Tolkien experienced firsthand the devastation and horrors of war, with the mud-filled trenches lined with the dead and dying, leaving a profound and lasting mark on him that would forever shape his view of the world. With his later descriptions of the battlefields of Mordor in his book Lord of the Rings, bearing a striking resemblance to the devastated landscapes that he witnessed there. The war would also enact a heavy personal toll, with many of Tolkien's friends, whom he had known since childhood, having been killed in action. Among them were Lieutenant Robert Gilson, who had perished while leading men on the first day of the Somme, and Lieutenant Geoffrey Smith, who had died from complications after receiving shrapnel wounds from artillery. When reflecting on the tragic loss of his dear friends, Tolkien later wrote, "By 1918, all but one of my close friends were dead." By October, his battalion were involved in another major assault on the Regina Trench, a significant German position consisting of deep dugouts and reinforced defences. It was during this time that Tolkien contracted trench fever. As his condition continued to decline, he was evacuated back to England on the 8th of November, 1916. After being hospitalised in Birmingham, his health remained fragile, with a weak and emaciated Tolkien spending the remainder of the war alternating between hospitals and garrison duty, having been deemed medically unfit for general service. On July 16, 1919, he was officially discharged from active service and given a temporary disability pension. The following year, on November 3, 1920, he was formally demobilised, retaining the rank of lieutenant. In the end, Tolkien had survived where many of his friends and comrades did not, but the war never left him.
According to his children, John and Priscilla Tolkien, in his later years, he would occasionally talk of being at the front, speaking of the horrors of the first German gas attack, of the utter exhaustion and ominous quiet after a bombardment, of the whining screams of shells, and the endless marching through a devastated landscape. While Tolkien had never wrote explicitly about the war, elements of the experience have lived on in his stories, ensuring that the lessons of the Great War, both its horrors and its heroism, would never be forgotten.